I'd like to welcome you here. My name is Craig, and I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. So, this talk is called TBD. I just wanted an excuse to say that. What it's actually going to explore, and as you know, I don't usually give long talks, so it'll be relatively quick and hopefully not too painful, is I was inspired to actually look back through all of the previous keynotes and briefly reflect on some updates. And then secondly, seems like a very, not a lot of brightness here. Can we kill any of the lights, I wonder? And secondly, a few thoughts about co-location. The first LESS conference was in Amsterdam in 2016. First, I think, proposed by Cesario. And the theme of what I shared that year, we called own versus rent, which is the idea that when you're working with people related to change, the most important thing is that they have engagement, motivation, and an intrinsic desire for the idea. And if we communicate any idea, whether it's getting healthy or adopting less, but the person doesn't own that idea, if they have to instead of want to, it's just a waste of time. And so one of the key themes was to focus much less on what and focus a lot more on, when you're working with people, on the question of why and ways that they can get to their intrinsic motivation. And if you don't solve that problem, all the teaching about Scrum ceremonies in the world is not going to make a bit of difference. And if you don't solve that problem, writing the less rules more precisely is never going to help anything. You know, better rules didn't solve lack of interest. So, catching up from 8 years ago, I kind of keep track of the psychological research in this area, and not only before 2016, but continuing up until now, all of the psych research related to change reaffirms our previous belief, which is that we really need to focus on engagement and owning more than anything else. Popular science books on the subject of change are always coming along. I'm sure you've read many of them. This is a good one from just this year or last year, How Minds Change. It's up to date and relatively well written. So if you're looking for a concrete short primer on the psychology of change and how to do it, good resources. And although I don't know a lot about it, some years ago I discovered open space agility. And who does not know about open space agility? Okay, good. So for your information, it's a kind of meta framework. You can stick inside of open space agility any organizational design or any approach to change within it underneath. But it's a meta framework where the creator, primarily I think Daniel Mezek, really focuses on the questions of owning versus renting by leadership and owning versus renting by the volunteers that are going to participate. And so there's obviously a connection between the thing that we were trying to share there, and encourage you looking at resources from that community. And just to summarize, after 8 years of this suggestion, yes, I feel it even more strongly than before as critical for sticky long-term change. So I often suggest to coaches and educators The thing to focus on more is why over what when we're communicating. Telling stories, presenting evidence, hearing experts, learning case studies to convince people really is not very sticky. Maybe it can maybe open a little door for some kind of a conversation, but it doesn't take you very far. And increasingly over the years, I focused on working with people where they're at giant wall spaces and we're doing systems modeling together, and I share very little, I explain very little, and my focus, both working with C-level and all the way up to the programmers, is actually having them focus on doing the personal reasoning themselves. So for example, if they want adaptiveness to be the optimizing goal or low lead time to be the optimizing goal, then having them, senior management and other people themselves, reason at the wall what kind of an organizational design is consistent with that, so that I'm not telling them through their own logic, their own quantitative analysis, are coming to the insight. And I continue to believe that this is so much more powerful than telling, because then people own the insights. And kind of as a corollary to that, bottom-up, deep change rarely works. As you know, one of the less suggestions is bottom-up and top-down. And it's really the case that senior management not only needs to learn the organizational design implications, they need to own them. And I visit so many coaches that go to work with management, and the focus is on teaching them what, the learnings of how and so forth, rather than the much deeper question of how can the senior management themselves go, wow, we really want to do this because we own this idea ourselves. And as a consequence, because I've increasingly discovered it's hard to get really C to C-2 people for even a full day in anything, I've just recently created a 4-hour organizational design and systems modeling workshop for executives, where I'll come in, for example, with the C-suite, and then through that 4 hours, I say almost nothing, but almost from the very start, they're heading for the whiteboards, they have a problem, and they're focusing on doing the personal reasoning themselves to discover what kind of organizational design is consistent or inconsistent with the things that they care about. 2017, which was in London, was interesting techniques for descaling. One of those I called more bang with lang and frameworks, so how you could have more consequence with less developers. And the only update that I want to make this year is that various multi-UI frameworks are maturing and becoming more and more really compelling and viable. Flutter being probably the preeminent example, where developers can just write once in one language and deploy on web, iOS, Android, etc. As I'm sure you all know, sometimes the complaint will be, because of heterogeneous languages and technologies, that, the Android developers, it's too much for them to learn to shift to iOS, etc. So we have ways to simplify that problem, and I encourage technical solutions to reduce the switching costs of learning. And I also discussed more bang with machine learning. And I have a keen interest in AI and self-driving cars. My graduate work's in AI, having little intelligence of my own. And something that I observe is that in Tesla, Google, Waymo, and Drive AI, and Comma AI, there's this consistent trend towards complete front-to-back, all functions being done with learning machines. In other words, no or almost no explicit programming by programmers, which means then the job of the programmers shift to setting up the learning models and the architecture of the learning models rather than writing code themselves. This isn't going to eliminate the need for programmers, of course, but I predict that in the future, less programmers will be able to create more bang because they'll be focusing on using learning machines to generate solutions. Oh, and a quintessential example of that coming up also is OpenAI codecs, such as the Copilot product from GitHub. And I just discovered yesterday Amazon is also coming out with a competitor to Copilot. I'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. More learning with less effort was the other thing I shared in London, and I emphasized the value of mobbing and specification by example as fantastic techniques to help that happen. And 8 years later, yes, I still feel that way. And I also talked about current architecture workshops as a way to simply and quickly help more people quickly and easily understand the overall architecture. And today in 2022, I rarely meet anyone who knows about this or knows how to use it. And so today at 10:45, Terry, the key creator of the less.works site, maybe Bus is coming too, I'm not sure, and others were going to actually demonstrate a current architecture workshop using less.works as the site example to coach people in how to do this. So it'll be a kind of workshop where we'll take less.works as the case. 2018 happened in New York City, and I shared some thoughts on cognitive biases in organizational systems. And one of the things that I shared was the well-known, something fell apart here. Is it probably a battery somewhere? Let's see if this still works. Oh, it still works. Something that I shared was the Big Five personality trait model, which is the only academically credible model created by scientists, by psychological scientists. So you might be familiar with things like Myers-Briggs and all of that stuff. If you didn't know, that's really no different than astrology. None of that is based upon science. It's just kind of made up ideas. The only personality trait model that is scientific is the Big Five, which came from psychology. And the A in the OCEAN acronym to remember the 5 elements stands for agreeableness. And as a very social species, we are super susceptible to excessive agreeableness. And I wanted to share a story about this. So a couple of years ago, during the height of COVID, I was working at a large customer in the United States. And because COVID was happening, they had tens of thousands of their developers go home and no one came to work. And then I was there working with the senior management group a few months after this happened. And a manager was happy to report to the CEO and others that there has been, and I quote, no impact from working at home on the value delivery for our tens of thousands of developers in our company. There's been no impact from everyone just going home at all. And so therefore, the conclusion was that they should shut down all of their big development sites around the US, the world, and from now on just have tens of thousands of people working at home because it has no impact on value delivery. Well, I was curious because whenever you hear metrics, I recommend you dig into the details behind this. And so I found some of the people that were actually involved in creating this metric, and I asked them, how do you define value? So here's the definition of value. Any document that anybody creates is value. So if a business analyst creates paper documents, they've delivered value. If an architect creates a drawing, they've delivered value. If a component team member creates some lines of code and checks it in, they have delivered value. And then I asked, well, surely you understand that that's not really value from the point of lean thinking. Almost all of those things are waste. And here's what the person replied. She said, we don't want to make people feel bad here. So we've called everything that they deliver value so that people don't feel bad about what they're doing. And the CEO and the C-2 had no idea that this was the definition. They actually thought something was being shipped and some business value was being the result. And so the scales fell from their eyes, and they realized that the entire definition of what was going on in their company was nonsense. And all of this was in the feeling of excessive agreeableness so that people didn't feel bad. So watch out. 2019 was in Munich, and I shared Elinor Ostrom's core design principles when there is a commons. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics for this work. It's very deep work. And as Bus alluded to yesterday in his talk, there are various commons that we have in LESS, the most important one of which is shared code. And I explored the 8 principles that Ostrom identified. This is not the place to go through them again. I'm not trying to repeat these lectures. And yesterday, Bus shared some information from Donella Meadows in the book Thinking in Systems, where managing the commons, some of the suggestions she made was to educate and exhaust, and second, possibly to regulate the commons. Now, regulate the commons is a kind of motherhood statement because it doesn't explain in any concrete way how groups successfully do that. And that's where Elinor Ostrom's work comes in, because step 2, regulate the commons, breaks down into the details of how that really concretely happens according to the research. Google Code is one commons. Second, this is the best book I have ever read in software engineering ever, by far. In my opinion, it essentially makes any other software engineering book ever written essentially just to be deleted. It's such a step change in sort of quality and insight. And I'm not going to do this, but having read through this book, I could see many connections between Ostrom's 8 core design principles and things that the Google organization was doing. And I bet there's a fun little blog post for somebody to write to more strongly make the connections between Ostrom's principles and what Google is doing as explained in this book. 2020 was in Amsterdam during the height of COVID, and I shared some comments about learning adaptiveness. And one of the things that I started to share was explaining that what adaptiveness implies is not only delivering fast with a low transaction cost, but adaptiveness also implies the ability to switch in new unanticipated directions with a low cost. We call this low switching cost. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this basic point, I encourage you to remember this, that the adaptiveness movement was not started with the vision of delivering fast. That's a widespread and strong misunderstanding. The Agile movement was not started with a focus on flow, a widespread misunderstanding. The idea that motivated the folks in the original Agile movement was the humility of recognizing that what we're doing is probably wrong, and then from feedback, changing direction to a new, unanticipated direction. Agile isn't for delivering projects efficiently. It's a model of learning loops where we discover through humility, oh, our guesses were incorrect. Let's move in a new direction that we didn't think about before instead of following a project. And then that leads to the question, well, how much does it cost us? What's the friction in our organization and practices to switch to a new, unanticipated direction? And as I shared in that 2020 talk, things like efficient sprints and incremental flow are supportive of low transaction costs. And I commented that it seems to me that almost all information and coaching courses in the world from that day until today are just focused on that side of the understanding of adaptiveness. And there's almost no education and coaching focused on this key important side of what adaptiveness is really about, which is switching direction, efficient change and being adaptive. And there's the least amount of coaching and information on this side. And I'd like to encourage you as coaches to focus less on talking about speed, less on talking about flow, less on focusing about fast, and instead focus on what this movement started with, which is changing direction based upon learning rather than following a plan. And I see no change in this widespread misunderstanding in industry. I also shared some thoughts on the coming impact from automation and especially AI automation on single-skilled workers. And the key point that I wanted to make in that talk was that single-skilled workers, like if a person's only a UX designer, or if a person's only a database designer, or a JavaScript developer, then because machine learning is becoming better and better at single-task mastery, that if people only do one thing in development, they're going to start to get automated away. And that what will become increasingly valuable for humans, the value add for humans, will be the ability to learn new things and adapt in response to feedback. So, for example, some years ago then, there was this and yes, that is likely to happen. And since that time, if you've been following AI research, you probably know that DALL-E has come out and now DALL-E 2. And if you're unfamiliar with these technologies, which are now starting to take the world by storm and are just in sort of beta phase and are going to get better and better, with these technologies which have been trained on every visual image, every movie, and every piece of art ever created by humankind, you can then just type in text to DALL-E and it will generate pictures for you. And some artists might say today, with looking at DALL-E 0.1, oh, that's never going to get better than us artists. Well, watch out. This is going to get really good really fast. And for a subscription of $100 a year, companies will be able to get this stuff and just blow away what graphic artists can do at 1 billion times faster and with more variety. So if you've got kids that are thinking of a career in commercial art, I recommend you nudge them towards doing that as a hobby, but less likely as a profession. So I tried it the other day. As some of you know, my hobbies are kiteboarding and playing guitar, both of which I do badly. So I just typed in kiteboarding, playing guitar on Mars, and that's what I got. So that's with DALL-E 0.1. And I also explored the question, are coders going to get automated away? And the quick answer is no, but the journey of programmers over the decades has been working at higher and higher levels of abstraction, and increasingly developers will need to develop skills in machine learning and essentially moving to that end of the pipeline of development. And GitHub Copilot is an example of this. And I'm going to give just a very brief demo if you haven't seen this. Here we are in Visual Studio, and I'm sorry that the light is not very good, but the key point is you don't need to see the details to understand what I'm going to share. So Copilot, I can for a moment, but I'm going to have to type in a moment. Copilot is a product now from Microsoft, who owns GitHub, and they've gotten the technology through OpenAI, who created GPT-3. And GPT-3 is a language transformer model, and OpenAI directed essentially the transformer model at all of GitHub and then trained a learning machine so that it can generate code for you. And I'd like to demonstrate how this actually works. So here I am on this side, and again, the fine details don't matter. It'll just be kind of a big, vague picture, which will be good enough to make sense. Over here on the right, I've actually got a Python file, and on line 1, which you surely can't see, I've got a space for a comment. And what I'm going to do now is type in a comment and then press Control Return, which is then going to engage Copilot to do something. So this is a comment line in Python, and I'm going to type in. So I'm typing in initialize machine learning transformer. By the way, just while it's on my mind, completely unrelated. If any of you are interested in starting to learn about machine learning, you might know that there's been a variety of architectural models over the years, convolutional networks, recurrent networks, and so forth. Forget it all. Now in 2022, DeepMind from Google, OpenAI, Meta researchers have all focused on realizing that transformers are essentially the current best-of-breed architecture. And so all of the prior old-fashioned models like recurrent, convolutional networks, forget it. Just focus on learning about transformers. Also, if you're taking a course in AI and they want to teach you about linear algebra and calculus, find another course. That's just nuts and bolts that people don't need to know. Anyways, now back to the key point. I'm now going to press Control Return. I just typed in a Python comment which said initialize machine learning transformer, and I press Control Return, and it's generating the code. And now we see that it's generated all the code for that. By the way, I've also done things like initialize a Monopoly game, initialize a Facebook app, and it'll just generate the code for it, which is insane. But it's even more interesting. So for example, let's suppose I go down here, looking at some code, and looking for some kind of interesting code, not really boring code. Yeah, nothing really interesting there. I'm going to initialize a Monopoly game to explain the next point. So, for example, initialize a Monopoly game. And I'm just looking for some kind of non-import statements that are kind of interesting. We'll just take this as an example. It's very trivial, but it's enough to just make the point. It would have been more interesting if I could have used it with machine language example, but not important. Now, so imagine that I don't know what that code does. So now they've also got AIs that can explain to you existing code. And so I could take these lines of code that I don't know what they do. I don't even want that. And imagine I say explain it. And it over there gives me the explanation. Now that was trivial in this case, but if I were to copy paste a whole bunch of machine learning code, it would give you a detailed and clear explanation in English of what all the code is doing. This is insane. Thank you very much. I mean, what's this going to do to the future of programming is really interesting. I have on my idea list creating a next generation learning resource for university students learning software design, because I'm an author of an old book which is very popular on the subject. But now, what do I say? What's the future of teaching software development when tools like this are coming along? It's going to be a very interesting time. And this connects with adaptiveness, of course, because now programmers are moving to this higher level of abstraction where they're going to increasingly be having to shift across different domains with these power tools. 2022 explored the point that, to explain briefly how I got here, when COVID started, I became very interested in reading medical research studies. And when I got into them, I appreciated the degree of rigor, statistical rigor, design of experiments rigor that are set up in medical research. Randomized controlled trials, triple-blinded, really careful, because it's very clear how complicated it is to understand causality and the many confounding factors. Then I stepped back and I looked at, well, what is research in universities for business and management? And it's a joke. It's just a joke. Looking at case studies, interviewing people, and then making so-called management and business research conclusions, that is utter nonsense once you understand the proper design of experiments and how difficult it is to understand causality. And as a consequence, the research conclusions in almost all of business and management are no better than astrology. They're just essentially grasping at straws and making stuff up. I don't think there's a single conclusion that's been advised in management or business that you can take with any confidence has anything to do with being actually supported by research. In other words, it's all bullshit. It's just pathetic how low the quality of research is in management. If I was a university professor in management or business, I should be ashamed of myself. Around the world, from Harvard to MIT to you name it. And there's been no change in that very low quality, and there's been no change in the lack of awareness. I continue to see surveys and case study reports online and in various articles that explain that this business did that and therefore it causes this, which is all just nonsense. And another point that I made is that therefore every industry and every university academic report making any claims at all in management and business on any subject, from Agile to OKRs to you name it, is just bullshit. There's no statistically significant evidence based upon randomized controlled trials for anything in business or management. And there's been no change for that, and no change in the awareness of how low quality management advice is. The last thing that I wanted to share was a few thoughts on co-location. Most of this is obvious, but I think worth emphasizing. If the main activity of work is Gita does her tasks and delivers her stuff, then the impact of working at home is very different than if the main activity of work is Gita deeply learns new things from her teammates. And I've read many online articles and so-called research reports on the impact of working at home, and I haven't yet seen a single case where the framing of the work was learning from other teammates. All of the discussions were just about the worker at home doing their tasks and delivering their stuff. And so that's a very different question on work than teams learning from each other and the impact that comes from being distributed in that context. Well, this is relevant because if any of you have read the original HBR popularizing article, The New Product Development Game, Takuchi and Nonaka identified key elements in what was making Scrum, or the roots of Scrum, effective, and multi-learning and an organizational transfer of learning were central to this insight. And if a person thinks that learning from others is not affected by people working at home, I disagree. It definitely affects the ability of people to learn from each other, at least today in 2022. So to make the point clear, to increase adaptiveness, multi-learning and an organizational transfer of learning are critical elements. And if the building block of our organizational unit is Gita, and Gita does her tasks and delivers her stuff, then the impact of working at home is very different than if the building block, which is the case in less, is a real team with a shared work and shared goal. We ignore 2.5 million years of evolution on the fact that we're social primates, hunter-gatherers in small tribes. If we ignore that evolutionary psychology, I suggest we do so at our peril. And, well, I was under 45 once. And it's pretty predictable that people, especially under 45, blithely and naively ignore evolutionary psychology. I also noticed that, it's not so important. By the way, maybe your English word for the day, blithely, means casually indifferent. There's now some new, weak, it's not very strong, I don't know if we can really rely on it, but there's some hints from fMRI research where they've put people in fMRIs and then have them chat over Zoom to other people, that the emotional and social psychological centers and circuits in the brain do not become activated. And whatever, old timer, who cares about that? Someone might say to me, if I raise that as a concern. But I'd like to suggest that what we're concerned with is people in teams trusting each other. We're social primates, etc. That to ignore these subtle and really understood forces, it's naive to assume that these don't have an impact. And there's an important scenario in working at home that I don't see discussed. And that's this. You've got a co-located real team, great. But then COVID happens and then everyone goes home. Okay, maybe they all trust and know each other, not such a big deal. But a new employee joins the team working at home. And of course, this is not going to be a rare situation. This is going to be a common situation if you've got contexts in which everyone's working at home. And something that I don't see being discussed is what happens to the ability of that new person to actually gain the trust of the other people in their so-called team whom they haven't physically spent lots of time with. Well, there are no research results on that, but I wouldn't be surprised from my very limited understanding of psychology that the implications of that are far deeper and more profound than we understand at the moment. My friend and colleague Bus, he went through this exact experience. I haven't talked about it with him in depth yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that he had a lot of trouble getting a sense of trust and real connection with his so-called teammates in this context. And maybe talk with him about that later on if you're curious. Now, I'm not physicalist biased. I don't have any special attraction to the physical world. I understand that at this very moment, we're all just brains in a bowl. And what we're experiencing at this moment is not reality, but there's something like a 10 millisecond delay between the sense inputs come in and then our brains form a model of the world, which is you and me here in this moment. In other words, we're living in a brain simulation. And that's true. And so I understand that you could replace that with something else. So I'm happy to hear that Meta, Facebook, has now made their number one, if you didn't know this, their number one strategic goal for the next 15 years, which they're pouring money and talent into, is solving AR, VR, so that in, say, 15 years, it actually works. And so I do believe that we will make progress in this so that at some point in the future, So meta researchers estimate that, it's probably at least 15 years before we'll have VR and AR that fools the brains and gives a sense of real presence. And I want to double click on that point just for a moment. If someone tells you today, oh yeah, video conferencing tools are so good, we don't really need to worry about that anymore, well, the world's top companies that are trying to solve this problem, Apple as well, disagree. From their point of view, we are far, far away from having quality tools for distributed communication in ways where there's real presence. But there is hope, and I think we will get there. And then maybe in 15 years or 25 years, we will have something like this. And then I'm not here, and you're not here, and it doesn't matter. And when that happens, then people working at home might not be such a big deal. But I encourage people to be very cautious about that it's not a big deal for real teams today. So maybe there's going to be some future less rule update. Maybe the future rule will say something like immersive co-location over dislocation. Thank you. Oh, I forgot one minor thing. So this is my logo for less. And you know Bus's logo for less, which is the official logo. And years ago, I suggested to Bus, less. It should be thin, elegant. It shouldn't be a big, fat logo. And Bus disagreed, and that's okay. But let's just do a quick poll. Who thinks my poll is better than Bus's? What's that? The color doesn't matter. I'm just thinking about the shape. Who thinks this is better? And it's okay if you think. Okay, so 50-50. Maybe Bus is right. He often is. Thank you.
Very provocative, and thank you. It was wonderful seeing the span of topics and just the changes. Since it's my first LESS conference. A couple of things, it's more commentary. I want to encourage you, and I'm more than happy to sit down and share some real detailed work, but there are thought leaders that have been doing work in the area of leadership development for over 50 years. And also a couple of thought leaders that I follow doing big data, team effectiveness work, and I'm actually going to speak to it this afternoon, which is massive amount of quantitative data that proves the conditions and the necessary facets of what is effective leadership and what effective teaming is. So I encourage, I truly believe 80% of what you stated of management principles and all these studies are weak, but there are people doing some very deep work and getting peer-reviewed for reliability, consistency, that what they're measuring measures what's supposed to be measured. And I think we need all of it. We don't need just some of it.
So the journey of research and the design of experiments, so those are essentially what are called associational studies, because they're not actually doing randomized controlled trials. And the journey of medicine and the other sciences was that in the old days, they used to believe that big data associational studies could actually draw out causal conclusions. And where statisticians and others have landed in 2022 is pretty unequivocal, that without a randomized controlled trial, big data associational studies cannot identify causality, regardless of peer review. So you can have a key point, peer review does in no way guarantee that anything is correct. It's very important to understand. Peer review simply means that in the scope of what you're exploring, it's not bullshit nonsense or methodologically invalid. So, for example, an observational study could be well done and it could be peer-reviewed and published in a paper. But if you read that and if you can see it's an observational study, you should make no assumption that it can conclude anything. We could have big data for millions of employees and teams and managers in an observational study, and we can't unfortunately draw any causal conclusions from that, which is why the scientific world has moved increasingly to RCTs as the only good way that we can come up with. So I'm increasingly skeptical the more years that pass.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. I want to ask about the last point, the co-location, because last year I had to work in a fully remote team. So first, I think I agree 100% that we too easily say that people work from remote and life will be as usual. It won't, for sure. But what challenges my mind that what trade-offs you are making. And what we learned, if you hire people across few time zones, few cities, you remove that bottleneck of my people can be 2 hours from the office, right? And my question is there a way to think that maybe that trade-off, that I have way more skilled ability to hire way more skilled people, and then I will find a way how that team will interact in a remote world, plus probably will meet physically together time to time, can be a bit even more effective than, if I'm really constrained by hiring my teams only 2 hours from the office and trying them to make the most effective team. So I'm just trying to say that, is there actually, if you put the thought process, how you build the remote and distributed teams, is there a way to go out? Or, we still claim that only magic happens if you 100% sit in a physical environment. Because what I learned, you need that physical environment, but even in old days, you're not spending all your time around the fireplace telling the stories. You do that, but then probably for 2 months you went hunting and you didn't see your mates, but you came back and built that trust and relationships. So can we find somewhere in between that with physical meetings and spending time together, but maybe 80% time you're working from home environments and can I find the magic efficiency here?
Yeah, a few thoughts. First, many people apparently have not read the second Less book's multi-site chapter, because this very question is not new to me and Bus. In the second Less book, many years ago, we have a variety of experiments for people that are working distributed. So this is not new, and we already have suggestions for how to deal with this. In the first Less book, one of the chapters in the thinking tools sections is called false dichotomies. False dichotomies is when people set up arguments or propositions as only having two alternatives, such as, for example, all together all the time or all distributed all the time. That's a false dichotomy. And we're always exploring things in the middle, moving beyond the false dichotomy. And the multi-site experiments have ways to help reduce that. Like, for example, teams coming together sometimes, and there's other experiments as well. So if anyone incorrectly thinks that Bus and I have never interacted with organizations having some distributed workers, that's not true. We've been in this world for decades. And if people think that Bus and I have never worked using video conferencing tools for years interacting with people at other sites, that's not true. We have, and we have experiments in both the second and the third book for that. So this is not about just one or the other, but recognizing that in 2022, because of the psychological factors, we can't ignore the fact that we need some mechanisms for psychologically to gel teams. But combined with more technologies, some increasing distribution will be successful as well. I know that's not a very deep or interesting answer, but I just wanted to double click on the point that people often don't understand that Bus and I have been involved in distributed work for years and appreciate it.
You said that you're aim is to reduce or eliminate suffering in product development.
Reduce.
Reduce. But you also, and a lot of people talk about the importance of co-location. My own experience is that the office has been the biggest source of suffering for myself and its own limitations. And that's something that I feel is absent on this call to come back to the office, the emotional aspect of it.
I don't know if this is actually a principle in lean thinking, but it's certainly in the spirit of what Toyota emphasizes. If it's painful and it hurts, do more of it. Because you're typically avoiding the issue. So we don't need to open the box up on your problem, but why is it painful to go back at work? And your organization perhaps and your people are not confronting those deep, unresolved, and poisonous issues. They don't go away from everyone staying at home. They're just unresolved. And so I would suggest as a generalization, if something hurts, look at it rather than avoid it.
I just would like to know your thoughts about a recent phenomenon I see with many colleagues. So they starting multiple jobs at the same time in cause. Yeah, it's so.
Because they're working at home?
Yeah. Is it something you know, and do you have any thoughts about that?
I hope they make lots of money. No, I mean, if it can work, why not? The if is a big question. But again, moving beyond the false dichotomy, neither Bus nor me are into this end of the spectrum or that end of the spectrum. Most of the things that we're suggesting is, the in-between, the middle path. Done. Thank you.